Hi, I'm Leigh Ridings. I am an assistant professor at the Medical University of South Carolina. I'm in the College of Nursing there, and I'm actually a clinical psychologist by training. And I'm also the associate director for Child and Family Services for our Trauma Resilience and Recovery program there at MUSC, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. So I'm excited to be talking about this presentation, which is using mHealth or mobile health to close the service gap after pediatric injury. So if anyone has any questions at all, I'm going to be available whenever you can watch this presentation. So please go ahead and just write any comments or questions or anything that you have in the chat box, and I'll be sure to address those as I can. All right. Okay, so I just want to give a little bit of background to talk about what we're going to talk about today. So, more than 20 million children experience unintentional injuries every year, and we're talking about in the U.S. So, over 225,000 of these children require hospitalization. And I think that number is a little bit higher now, but just to give some background, we're not talking about those kids who go to the ED because they've fallen off their bicycle or, their skateboard or something like that. These are the kids who have been hospitalized. So that 225,000 number, those kids who experience things like motor vehicle collisions, they've been struck by an automobile, so pedestrian versus auto, animal bites go into that, serious falls, all of those types of injuries that land kids into the hospital and require hospitalization at that point. So that's a lot of kids that we're dealing with every year. And this is associated with annual individual and societal costs of over $87 billion. So this is not something to just kind of write off. And what we know is for those kids who are hospitalized, kids who experience what I'm going to refer to as pediatric injury or traumatic injury for this presentation, we know that it can negatively affect multiple domains of functioning, things like quality of life, mental health outcomes. So we know that more than 20%, about 20 to 40% of kids who experience serious pediatric traumatic injuries go on to develop mental health difficulties such as post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, depression, for example, and other types of acute stress reactions potentially after they've experienced these injuries. We know that it obviously affects physical recovery, and there's a healing process that comes after that, which also can feed into things like mental health outcomes. If a kid's, sitting in his bed because he can't walk anywhere, then that could lead to mood difficulties, for example. It also can disrupt family roles and routines. All of a sudden, families are kind of having to figure out their new normal for a while after pediatric traumatic injury. And things like academic functioning, having to be back in school or miss some school or concentration difficulties. So we know that this is something that's really important that we need to be paying attention to. So when we think about all of those different domains that where kids can be impacted, we also have to think about the importance of caregivers, right? So anytime that we're focusing on that pediatric population, we have to think who are the caregivers that are responsible for their sort of day-to-day lives and all of those different areas of functioning. Caregivers are a key source of support following pediatric injury. So we know that these caregivers are the ones who are potentially going to be addressing their physical recovery and also their emotional recovery after pediatric injury. As a result of that, caregivers' own emotional health is really highly correlated with children's outcomes following trauma. So this is in kind of traumatic events. It makes sense, right? If caregivers, their children are experiencing some kind of a traumatic event, such as a serious injury, then we know that their own emotional health is going to be seriously linked, significantly linked to their kids' outcomes and vice versa. And actually, we see this in the research. So 20 to 40% of caregivers develop high distress and significant PTSD symptoms or post-traumatic stress disorder following pediatric injury. So this is really important. This suggests that even the caregivers who don't experience the injuries themselves, this is their kids who experience the injury, even if caregivers weren't present for that, up to 40% of them can actually go on to develop their own PTSD or depression symptoms after their kids experience that injury. And, for those of you who might be parents or work with parents, it makes a lot of sense, right? If my kid's not doing well or experiences some kind of a traumatic event or significant event, I'm not going to be doing well. If I'm not doing well as the parent, then that's going to impact how my kid recovers as well, right? So I think it makes a lot of sense that we see this link here. And so what that suggests is that caregiver distress is and should be a target for intervention. Anytime that we're trying to address that emotional health recovery or physical health recovery of these kids, we really should be considering caregivers who often sort of get forgotten or maybe not addressed in all of this when really we should be targeting them. This really gives us an opportunity for impact. We know that we have lots of great effective treatments that are based in research for post-traumatic stress disorder, mood disorder, some major depressive episodes, and we know that those are widely available. However, there's some reason why a lot of people, about 30% of people actually don't go on to get their own treatment, even though they need it. There's lots of access barriers that we're dealing with here. So things like stigma, for example, mental stigma. So if I have to go and get help for my mood problems or problems with depression or after this traumatic event, what are people going to think of me? Think I'm crazy. Cost is a big one as well. So maybe a lot of people would like to go get that treatment, but they don't have the money, or it's pretty costly, or insurance difficulties, etc. Transportation is also another one. So this may be present everywhere, but especially in our rural areas, we want to be considerate that people may really want to go get help or need help, but they don't have a way to get there. And this might be particularly true for this population of pediatric injury patients because they may have limited physical mobility. So for those people who experience traumatic injuries, they may not be able to drive, for example, because of that. So it may also further limit their ability to get the help that they need. We know that trauma centers have a really great opportunity here to address that need, to help get them the help that they need after pediatric traumatic injury, to help with, PTSD, depression. However, about less than 7% of level 1 to 2 trauma centers routinely even screen for things like PTSD. So we have this problem where we have kids going into the hospital for pediatric injury, and they, a lot of them are in need of some services, or their caregivers are in need of some services to help address acute stress reactions, PTSD, etc. But people aren't screening them. They do a really great job of addressing their physical care in the hospital and in those trauma centers, but then across the country, we're seeing this deficit where people aren't really getting the help that they need. So we know that we need scalable, sustainable models of care to help address that. And digital health technologies are a way that we can help to try to close that gap, where we can maybe use technology as a way to reach this population and help embed some kind of existing intervention into these trauma centers, or find a way to use telehealth or other kinds of technology to reach this population. So to address this need more broadly, our team at the Medical University of South Carolina developed TRRP, the Trauma Resilience and Recovery Program. This was developed back in 2015, even before I joined the team, actually, as a stepped model of care, which I'll talk briefly about on the next slide, as a way to help make sure that we are doing those screenings for this population, and not just kids, but for ages 0 to 100. To do some kind of a screening in the hospital, figure out who needs services from there, and then help get them linked up to mental health services to address those gaps there. This is a stepped care service. TRRP is a stepped care service, and it actually started through funds from the South Carolina Telehealth Alliance, and it's kind of just grown from there. But where we have step one is to educate and enroll patients who've been hospitalized for traumatic injuries. So the idea here, before COVID, whenever we were actually able to be in the hospital, and hopefully once again we'll do that again. But we meet trauma activated patients in the level 1 trauma center, provide some education, just kind of broadly about mental health recovery after traumatic injury, just of what sorts of things to expect, what sorts of things to look out for. Just be on the aware, be aware of what your symptoms might be, and if your heart starts to race whenever you get back in the car, things like that. So that's step one. We meet with all patients and we do a brief hospital screen with them to screen for symptoms of paratraumatic distress. So, did you think that you were going to die, for example? Have you found that you can't stop worrying since the accident or the incident? Things like that. Really, just with the idea to be able to figure out who might be at higher risk to develop those mental health problems down the road. So that's step one. Step two, while we're still in the hospital, we also ask if our patients would like to enroll in our automated text message symptom monitoring service, with the goal again for them to just track their emotional recovery in about that 1 month period from the time of discharge from the hospital till about 30 days later, whenever we'll call them, which is step three. In step two, this is a text messaging service where patients get one text a day for 30 days. And it's really just a very basic question asking about general distress or anxiety, things like that, with the goal to be able to allow them to track their symptoms a little bit more. Don't put it on the burner, and make sure that they're just being aware, in addition to their physical recovery, of their emotional health recovery. At the end of that 30-day period comes step three, where we do a mental health screen with patients. We do a telephone screen with them, or with caregivers of these young kids, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. And we do a little bit more of a thorough screen there with the idea that in that 30-day period, we want that emotional recovery to kind of go down. We want there to be a natural recovery period for them. So we don't want to just get everybody who's highly distressed after a traumatic incident to enroll in services. So let that natural recovery period take place. But also we know that we can't diagnose things like PTSD until about 30 days after, once they've had some time. So at 30 days, we do that mental health screen with them, assessing for things like PTSD, depression. And then for those patients who do screen positive for PTSD or depression, then we offer them services, and that's step four. We can do that through telehealth or in person, again, assuming that COVID wasn't a thing, and we are able to offer them services at that point. And we can do that again through home-based telehealth or in person based on the patient's preferences. So that is the TRRP, or Trauma Resilience and Recovery Program model, that we have currently. This is really designed more to target any age, like I said, but we realize that for adults in particular, this is a really great model, but there might be some nuances and things that we need to be considering that maybe this model doesn't fully capture for our younger kids, for example. We know that a 3-year-old, this is going to look very different, right, from a 13-year-old or a 33-year-old. So we realize that there may need to be some tweaks in this model to make it so that it's really scalable and sustainable for our kiddos and our pediatric population and their caregivers. So we started looking at caregiver distress levels. We know that there is that link there between caregiver distress and child emotional recovery following a pediatric traumatic incident. So we started to look at our data to see what does this look like. And so we are asking caregivers about their distress levels in the hospital whenever it's their kid who has been the one who has been admitted for a traumatic injury. What we're seeing is that caregivers are really distressed. If you can see this graph here, whenever we look at our measure, our suggested clinical cutoff score for this general distress measure for caregivers is 14, and with scores greater than or equal to 28 needing immediate care. So whenever we have that as a guide, those caregivers who reach clinical significance, it's over 2/3. And those who attention, meaning we're really, really distressed, is just over 20%. So that is pretty telling that we have caregivers whose kids have been admitted, they're really highly distressed. If we know that they're highly distressed, but we don't have a whole lot of services to address that, and we know that caregivers' distress levels are highly correlated with how kids are going to do in their emotional recovery, and we're not really addressing it, then we might have this opportunity here for impact, or this potentially missed opportunity if we're not looking at these data and then doing something about it and tweaking that intervention. We took that information and we did a quality improvement initiative, kind of a pilot with caregivers of young kids. So we looked specifically for this project. We do have other projects that we're doing as well, but for this one, it was caregivers of kids under the age of 12. And we wanted to know, it seems like people are pretty distressed, but let's hear from them in a qualitative way where we do phone interviews with them to get more information. So we wanted to obtain feedback for services and resources that may address emotional recovery after hospital discharge. So what's happening in that time from the time that the kids are discharged from the hospital, and maybe even that 30-day period, what's going on, and is there an opportunity for impact? And we wanted to know what that experience was like for them. So we did these semi-structured qualitative interviews with 20 caregivers of kids under the age of 12 who've been hospitalized for traumatic injury. Most of them were motor vehicle collisions or MVCs. We also had a good were pedestrian versus auto. This could be kids that were hit on their bike and falls, and then some burns as well. Kids were about 6, which makes sense, is right there in the middle. And 70% of these caregivers were caregivers of boys, which is consistent with what we see more broadly across the nation. And then we had a pretty good breakdown of racial differences here, where we had 40% Caucasian and 40% African American. What we found in doing those interviews is that, yeah, people are pretty distressed. The caregivers were saying, some of them were saying, I was really distressed. I remember at least one person saying, I had to move because the incident happened at the house, and every time I went back there, I was just so distressed I couldn't stay there anymore. So we had to move. So people were saying, our emotional needs in the hospital are varied. Sometimes the caregivers were really distressed. Sometimes the kids were sort of, nervous about what was going to happen or what that meant for them. And it really could be enhanced by the staff. And they were interested in learning about ways that the staff in the hospital could help kind of facilitate that emotional recovery. There was also an interest in technology enhanced services. So we asked them, if an app or a website of some sort were available, then would you have used it? Something to kind of help promote that emotional recovery, kind of give you the idea of what to expect after you leave the hospital. How do I talk to my kid about what happened? Do I just brush it under the rug, or do we talk about it more? How do we talk about his emotions whenever he comes home and he, is feeling upset? How do we do that? And they overwhelmingly said yes. We would like that. We would like education around distress and what to expect, and that it's normal. Coping tools for myself and my kid. Testimonial videos was a big one too, and connections to providers and families. They really wanted to be connected to other families who had been through something similar. It's not enough to hear, from our team what to expect, but to hear from those families, they wanted that support. And also that there were some barriers and facilitators to emotional recovery. Some of the barriers were we were just we have to adjust to our new normal and our new routine after we got home. It sort of disrupted things for us. So we no longer go, to school and then, baseball practice and then come home. It's a lot of different things that we have to figure out with work schedules and school and daycare. And then some facilitators too. We learned that those people who had emotional support from families, churches, friends, that was really helpful for them, and that they really leaned on that support. So we took those themes and we said, okay, people are asking for some kind of a technology enhanced service. Let's figure out what we can do. And that led us to our CARE model, or CARE intervention that we're developing. So CARE stands for Caregivers Aid to Accelerate Recovery After Pediatric Emergencies. This is a technology enhanced stepped care intervention to address families' post-injury mental health needs. And I say enhanced because I'll go through what this looks like, but it's not technology, solely a technology like an app or something. This is designed to be used in conjunction with other, face-to-face sorts of interactions with hospital staff, et cetera, which I'll talk about. So I applied for funding through the South Carolina Telehealth Alliance and was very fortunate to be awarded a pilot grant to basically build it and see if they come. And so I started this pilot with caregivers of those injured children under the age of 12 years, where we took their feedback from those interviews, developed those key components of care informed by that caregiver feedback, and then the goal was to just sort of design what this might look like in an app-based format for that component of it, the technology enhanced components. And then what we wanted to do was take those wireframes and take that to the families themselves, to new families of kids under the age of 12, and just see, what are your reactions to this? Does this sound like something that you would like, that it would be helpful for you in the days and weeks following, your kid's discharge? And so we did more qualitative interviews with 15 additional families. And the breakdown kind of looks the same again with this new sample. We did these in the home. So we basically took these wireframes, which I'll show you pictures of, and we just took it into their home, used an iPad, and said, here, click through this. What do you think about this? Would this be helpful? What kind of feedback do you have? And then we took that information and looked for themes. So these are just some examples of what we showed them, and this again is based on their feedback. So they said they wanted education. So we had them, we have an education section where they can look at different common caregiver experiences that they might, that they might think about, common child experiences, things to expect after pediatric traumatic injury, and what sorts of impacts on child's functioning. What might this look like behaviorally? How might they act at home, at school, with their friends? Are they going to be more withdrawn, etc.? We also had a how-to section, so how to cope with my emotions, how to help my family cope, how to talk with my kid. It's going to be really different how I talk with my 3-year-old versus how I talk with my 11-year-old. And then how to start a support group in my area to help really get at that connection piece that they were really looking for. We also have a tracking piece, again, to track their family's emotional recovery. So how can I track my symptoms, my kids' symptoms if they're old enough, and then viewing those results and viewing my child's results, and to see like, hey, I wasn't really paying attention to my emotional recovery before, but now that I am, I'm realizing I'm kind of highly distressed, and I wouldn't have known it had I not been tracking it here. And so we showed them an option to be able to view those results to see, in a graph kind of format, which I'll show you. And some relaxation tools. So how do I calm down? It's not just enough to say, hey, just relax. So we have diaphragmatic breathing or deep breathing skills that they can learn, guided meditations, something called progressive muscle relaxation, where they tense and relax different muscle groups throughout their body, just different ways that they can decompress and address their own emotional recovery to be able to help themselves and also their kids. So what we found in doing these interviews and showing them those mock-up designs is that 100% of this population of these for this pilot owned a smartphone. About 67% use health apps or websites like WebMD, things like that, to obtain medical information. And most use health websites over apps whenever asked about how they get information about their health. That's what we found. So this population, a lot of these people, probably not a surprise, have access to technology. So these are just some overall themes, and you can see that picture over on the right. We wanted a way to be able to tailor it to caregivers of kids who have kids under 0 to 3, and then also kids 4 to 7 and kids 8 to 11. We realized that those are going to look really different. So our idea was to have these different tabs that they could click on based on the age of their kid. But what we found is that they really wanted us to individualize it more, which makes a lot of sense, right? They wanted us to have the option to make it specific to the exact trauma type. So, for example, a kid who's experienced a gunshot wound might be very different from a kid who's been in a motor vehicle collision. So they wanted to be able to tailor it for that. They also wanted to be able to create profiles for each of their kids. So maybe I have 2 kids that were in the accident, one who's 3 and one who's 11. So I'd like to be able to create profiles to individualize the content. Matching their symptoms to PTSD, depression, anxiety, and also getting some notifications, reminders, and texts. They wanted to be reminded to kind of check in on themselves for their own self-care and for their kids. About 60% also wanted to change the formatting. Not surprising if you look to the right, that's just a stick figure. Our goal is to be able to change that eventually whenever our budget increases. But they wanted different font, more colors, graphics, changing those question marks to make it more obvious what they need to do to click on different parts of that person to get more information about their emotional recovery. And then linking in between the sections a little bit more. So if you tell me what to expect, what do I do with that information? Maybe sending me to the relaxation section. One person said, this is great. They were the same age, but they were still affected very differently. My first, one of my kids had more serious injuries than the other one did. They were both in the accident. So everything was completely different. So they really wanted to individualize the content. We also, about 80% of them still want those connections to families and professionals. So we have to listen to that feedback that they really want to be connected to other families and other caregivers who've been through that, but also professionals. So great, you tell me to track my symptoms, for example. Now, what do I do with that information? I'm highly distressed. Where do I go? Who can I talk to? What other families can I be connected with? And when do I contact a doctor, for example, for physical recovery problems or emotional recovery problems? And they just wanted additional information about 60. Maybe, give me some example questions to ask my kids. What can I say to them specifically? Clarify the benefits. Why are you're telling me to do this deep breathing, but what does it actually do for me? How is it going to actually calm me down? And they love the relaxation sessions. They love the options, and they wanted more of that. So we're trying to integrate more options for them. And then you can read a couple of things that they had to say. Also, when we asked about, okay, this is great, you wanted to have some kind of a app or intervention, when would you like to be shown the app? And about 73% said that they wanted it in the hospital. So yeah, just have somebody show me how to download the app in the hospital, and then I can use it as we kind of adjust to our new normal after we are discharged. And so they wanted to use it between the hospital stay and about 1 week once they sort of get their bearings and go home, and they can actually focus on their emotional recovery instead of, the physical part of things, which is very, very important. We said, who would you want to do this? Who would you want to show you this and go through this with you? And they said that they'd like for it to be someone in the hospital, a nurse, a child life specialist, a social worker. But about 27% said it doesn't really matter. Just show me who it is, or just show me what it is, and we can go from there. We also asked what else would be helpful, and they said maybe if somebody could call and just check in weekly. Maybe give us some handouts for what to expect as well. It can't hurt to have more information. Also, teach us how to talk to other people about trauma. How do I information to my kids' teachers, my partner, or my spouse, doctors, etc. So really what we found with this is that caregivers are really enthusiastic about this perceived value. We're excited about it, they're excited about it. And we know that anytime that we're developing some kind of a technology enhanced intervention, it's really, really crucial that we get key stakeholders' feedback, like caregivers in this case, trauma center leaders also to get their input. How could we refine this? How could we make this better? An iterative design process. So this isn't just a one-time, we'll make these changes and then move on, that we need to continue to get more feedback, continue to refine this app and this intervention, and get feedback as we go to make sure that it's still addressing these caregivers and these kids in the way that we hope, and that we can expand that reach. Next steps are to be able to bring this feedback that we got to our development team, refine those things that they asked for, so make those changes. We're hoping that we can use a budget that we now have to be able to refine that and make it more individualized for these caregivers. So can we make it so that they can create profiles at the beginning, for example? Can we connect them to other families, and how can we do that safely, thinking about confidentiality and HIPAA? And then our next step, once we've made those refinements, is to do some usability testing. Again, it's this iterative design approach, right, where we're continuing to get feedback from family and get some usability testing. And then once we finalize all of that, I was awarded a K-23 Career Development Award from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development through NIH to be able to take this project and expand it a little bit more and assess the feasibility of care with trauma center directors, trauma program managers, et cetera. And so that's the next step, is to be able to take those funds and test it and make sure that it's feasible to recruit this population. Once we do that, farther in the future, effectiveness, does this actually help promote emotional recovery, reduce symptoms, et cetera, and reduce the need for them to seek treatment down the road? And then to adapt this eventually, once we're able to finalize that and show that this works, that it's effective, adapt it for other settings and populations. So this is a model that can really be used in primary care, for example, in emergency departments more widely, not just the trauma centers. Maybe for populations, it's great here for pediatric injury, but also what about those who are at higher risk for child maltreatment, for example, those caregivers, addressing it with them and having a similar kind of step care model for those folks. Also, what about those kids with pediatric chronic illnesses? Can we also help the caregivers during those distressing times as well? So these are my acknowledgments. This is my team over to the left. Can't do this without them. The staff at MUSC. And you can see the research funding over here on the right. I'm very grateful to have my K-23, but also to have the funds from the South Carolina Telehealth Alliance, who really helped me get this project up and running and get it off the ground. So, and also MUSC Health Center for Telehealth. And that's all that I have. And I look forward to looking through these questions. Thank you.